Hello, and welcome to my first in a series of lessons on how to render multipaths into an EXR file in Mentalray. What I've got here is just a generic setup with a few different objects that have no inherent meaning whatsoever, just to illustrate a few different shading properties, and a very simple setup in a kind of like a studio psych type of environment as a background, one area light, and that's really about it. So with that, let me get back to my camera view that I want to render to, and I've already got some materials set up in the Hypershade that we're going to apply to these surfaces, and then we will begin exploring some rendering. So with that said, let me just open up the Hypershade. And what I've got here is I've got a few Mentalray materials and some Maya materials so that we can kind of see the differences between how the two react into the multipath system. And you should know that if you're going to be rendering in Mentalray into the multipath system, that you're going to always need to use one of the shaders that ends in passes. So for instance, we've got the MI Car Paint Phenomenon X passes, we've got the MI Metallic Paint X passes, we've got the MI Material X passes, and that happens to be the shader that we're using. And I've got three of those that I've just basically set to some preset defaults within the system. You can find those over here. And like for instance, I've just made that one chrome. I've come down here and I've used the glass thick on that one. And on this one, the red, I've used the glossy finish. Right now, I've got some Maya materials over here. They're all Lambert surfaces with different shading qualities. So, for instance, I've got one where I've turned the color all the way down and pumped up the incandescence. I've got a pure white for the psych, and a blue so that we can look at some color. So, with that said, let's just apply some of these shaders. So, with this one, I'm going to want to apply just the pure white to the psych. I'm going to want to apply the blue to the sphere. I'm going to want to apply the glass to the glass, the chrome to this shape, whatever it is, the incandescence to this plane, and the cube, I want to apply this red. Now also inside this glass, let me just kind of turn it to wireframe real quickly. I'm going to select it like that. I'm going to deselect it, and there's a little tiny nugget of color in there that I'm also going to add that blue to. Okay, so let's just go back to our camera view. Okay, so we're almost beginning to get ready rendering. I've also got an area light already set up. I'll go over some of the settings in that area light in a moment. And I want to just look at the render settings real fast. And basically, I've just kept everything very generic, except for the only thing that I've done is I've turned off Enable Default Light under the Common tab. And under the Quality tab, I have just set it to 1 instead of 0. No other changes other than that. So with that said, let's just save here. And let's snap off a rendering and see what we get. Okay, well, as you can see, we've got our rendering here. We've got basically a very generically lit scene. We're getting some shadows from the area light that are actually not too bad. You can see all of our shaders are working, and we've got no bounce light, so we're just getting basically acting like a very just direct lighting from that area light. So with that said, let's go and open up some of the settings, and let's begin to tweak our settings a little bit to get something a little bit nicer, and then we'll quickly move on to the multipath system. So with this said, I'm going to open up the render settings. And the first thing that I'm going to want to do is under the Common tab, I'm going to want to change the image format from Maya IFF to Open EXR. Okay? Now, under the Quality tab, let's just bump that up to a 2 for now, not 22, right? And let's set it to for right now we'll use Box. With some of the more final renders, we'll eventually switch to Mitchell. Well, why don't I put it on Mitchell now? It'll slow things down, but I'll pause the video while I'm rendering. Now, under Frame Buffer, we're going to want to open that up. Now, We're going to go over this a little bit in depth later, but we're going to want to obviously leave the gamma at 1 and take the data type and move that down to RGBA float 4 times 32-bit. Okay, what that's going to give you is it's going to give you your 32-bit EXR with an alpha channel, and any layer that we put into the multipath system will be embedded like a layer, like a Photoshop file that we'll be able to recombine in post. Okay, for the indirect lighting, I'm just going to turn on some final gather. For right now, I'm just going to set the accuracy down to 50, so we move kind of quick, right? I'm going to set the secondary diffuse bounces to 2. Right, we'll just keep rebuild on for right now, final gather quality, and I'm going to put that filter at 1. Okay, and that's really basically all that we need to really do. Well, actually, let's take that reflections, put that to 2, put that to 2, and put the max trace depth to 3. So it'll kind of turn off either one if it needs it or not. Right now, the last thing that we're going to need to do is come back under the quality setting. And under the ray trace quality, under ray tracing down here, we've already got ray tracing on, but we can see that our reflections and our refractions and our max trace depth are set too low. So I'm going to actually set these a little bit higher than the final gather ones, and I'll set this to something like that, 3, 3, and 6. So again, this isn't a ray tracing lesson, but it has to do with how many rays can pass through a surface. You have to have it set high enough that it can pass through multiple surfaces and bounce back to the camera. So now we got that said, let's just save it and let's snap off a render and see what the difference is. You can see that we're building the final gather pretty quick, right? We can already see that the lighting is vastly improved, just the final gather. We're getting some bleed in the final gather. So with that said, I'm going to pause the video and I'll come back when the render is done. Okay, well the rendering's done, and you can see that we're getting a little bit of color bleed down in there. The render's looking a little bit better than it was before. Our incandescent plane is really not casting too much final gather, and chrome in the glass look basically okay. The blue ball is doing what it needs to do. We need to get a little bit more light in the scene with the area light, so let's just make some quick adjustments, and then we'll snap off another render, and then we should then be ready pretty much to set up the scene for multipath. So I'm going to just look through this light, and I'm going to pull back a little bit, and then I'm going to actually angle it out a little bit more, and I'm going to increase the size of the area light. Now, I've got a few mental ray shaders attached to this area light that I'm going to adjust. I'm not going to get too into the details of them, but if you'd like to know more, then you can look at my tutorials on lighting and mental ray with physical lights and black bodies and all that kind of good stuff. So if we look in the hypershade, I'll just show you real quick. Okay. I'm going to come to the lights, I'm going to grab this area light, I'm going to graph it, and you can see that I've got a physical light into the light shader attribute of the area light, which basically makes the light behave physically correct, and I've got an MIB black body controlling the intensity of the light and the color temperature. So I'm just going to actually raise that intensity up to 300,000, which sounds like a lot, but this light sometimes can take very large numbers. Okay, so with that said, we've made some minor adjustments in the light. I'm going to come back to our render camera, and I'm going to select that plane, and I'm going to go over to its shader, and the incandescent shader, and under the incandescence, I'm going to select that. Whoops. Excuse me, and I'm going to pull that back up, and I've got it set to HSV, and under the values section, I'm just going to pump that up to 4. Okay, so if you can see hue, saturation, value, and the value is 4. Okay, with that said, let's just actually open up, snap off another render, and see what we get. We'll look at it a little bit while I'm, and then I'll turn it off and pause. You can see the scene's already brighter, getting some more clear color bleed. The light's spreading back a little bit farther into our cyc. I think this will be good. So I'm going to pause here, and I'll be back when the render is done. Okay, well the render is done and we can see that we're getting basically what I thought that we'd be getting. We can see that we've got a much brighter scene. We're getting some of the back of the cyc or the background. Our incandescent plane is casting some more bright incandescence onto the floor from the increasing the value of the incandescence. Our glass and our chrome are working basically correct, except for that we're probably going to need to increase some of the refraction passes because we're not quite seeing through all the way, and our final gather is a little bit splotchy. So with that said, I'm going to make a few adjustments. So I think I'm probably going to also turn the area light down a tiny little bit. We'll set up the final rendering and then we'll move on to part 2, setting up the multi-pass. Okay, so with that said, I'm just going to select this area light. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lower that intensity. I think I'm going to go back down to 200,000. Okay. Everything else was basically okay with the exception of the render settings. So I'm going to open back up the render settings here. I'm going to increase our final gather quality right now to about 100 or so. I think that that'll be okay. Right? Everything else I'm going to leave exactly the same, except for the one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on Enable Map Visualizer so that we can actually write out the final gather to disk and go from there. Okay? So, and then the other last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to the quality setting, and under this ray tracing attributes, I'm going to turn these to 10, 10, and 12. And it will, even though I'm only setting it to 12, like if it only needs 4 refraction rays and it needs 8 refraction rays, it'll adjust, but it'll never do more than 12. So even though this adds up to 20, I'm saying don't ever do more than 12, and that's basically what that setting is. And we've got it set to Mitchell, which is pretty good, and we're going to increase the quality sampling to 3. Okay, so this render is going to take considerably longer to render. But other than that, I think that we're going to be basically okay. Oh, I think the last thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to take the shadows and I'm going to put that up to 4 for now. That'll give it 4 passes so that we just make sure that we get all the way through that glass. Okay. The last thing that I'm going to probably do here is I'm going to come back to this area light. And I'm just going to bump these up a little bit. I'm going to take that to 16. I'm going to set that to 8. And I'm going to set the low samples to 4. High samples 16, sorry, that's what I meant. That's what I'm going to do. Low samples is 4, the high sample limit will be 8, and the high samples are set to 8. So this again is going to increase the rendering time, but it's going to dramatically increase the quality of the shadows on that lights. So let's save the scene. Let's open up the render view. This is our last render. Let's put it into the graph, and let's snap off another render. Now, this is going to take considerably longer, so I'm just going to pause here. We see the final gather is started, and that's that. Okay, the render's done, and we can see that the render looks much better. The lighting's a little bit more equalized, not so hot. I'm getting some of the reflections and refractions of this shape through the glass. Everything's looking pretty crisp. The splotchiness of the final gather seems to basically be gone. So I think we're ready to set up the multi-pass system. So I want to make one quick note here, which is that as you've seen, I've been under the quality setting, I've been setting the filter to Mitchell, which is great for stills, but if you were rendering an animation, chances are you'd probably want to set it to Gaussian, which is a little bit better for animations. Mitchell's a little bit hard, but it's great for stills. And the other last thing that I'm going to want to do, because you'll see here that we've baked out the final gather to disk, so we can see the final gather points. So under the indirect lighting tab, I'm going to come down to final gather, and under the final gather, we can see that we've got the map, and I'm going to put it on off. Okay, great. With that said, let's move on to part 2, setting up the system for multi-pass rendering.